skies will be filled with the greatest air armada the world has ever seen. Our own Army Air Forces, the best planes ever built, 65,000 planes this year. And by the time you finish your training, America will have overwhelming superiority in the air.
So the subject today is Operation Thursday and the birth of Air Force Special Operations. Operation Thursday took place in a place far, far away in the China-Burma-India theater, which is kind of the backwater of World War II, but a very important backwater. And the motto of Air Force Special Operations today is any place, anytime, anywhere, and that comes out of Operation Thursday. The aircraft you see there are CG-4A gliders. No engines, just rope. And the gliders play a very large role in this operation that we're going to hear about this morning. So what's the China-Burma-India theater? We'll talk a little bit about that. And we'll talk about the Japanese conquest of Burma. That country today is called Myanmar, and the efforts during World War II to eject the Japanese from Burma. And we'll tell you why Burma was an important place. We'll also introduce you to a guy by the name of Orde Wingate. Anybody ever heard of Orde Wingate before? Yay, a couple people. Orde Wingate was a British general officer who specialized in unconventional warfare. And he put together a sizable force called Chindits. And I will explain why those people are called Chindits. And it ultimately leads to the formation of what was then called the first Air Commando Group, which was the first Army Air Forces group specifically organized to conduct unconventional warfare. You see on the, there's Operation Thursday and its legacy. You see on the right there the picture C-47 transports. They also played a very big role in this operation. So first let's start with the China-Burma-India theater. Now I bet many of you think World War II maybe started in 1939. Nope. Maybe you thought it had started in 1941 when Japan bombed Hawaii. Nope. Started in 1937 with the Japanese invasion of China. And all of that green mess you see north of the circle is area occupied by Japan. And so there was a big fight with the Japanese in China and in Southeast Asia. So another player in our story is the French colony of Indochina. That is today's Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. Okay. Another player is Thailand, the Kingdom of Thailand, then called Siam by many people, has a minor role in our story. There's Burma, and that's where most of the action is going to take place as we unfold Operation Thursday. And there's India, a huge colony of Britain at the time. So Britain's colonies included Burma and India, and the French had Indochina for a while, and Thailand was an independent country. So Southeast Asia, 1940-41. 1940 in Europe, France falls to the German onslaught. That means that France is no longer strong to occupy its colony in Indochina, and the Japanese move in and take it over. So what is today Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia gets occupied by the Japanese. And that's on the far right of your screen at the outside of the circle with the kind of pink and blue stripes. In December 41, Thailand becomes a Japanese ally. Thailand thinks it sees Japan becoming the dominant power in the Pacific. It sees its neighbors, the British, fleeing essentially. It sees Americans suffering a defeat at Pearl Harbor and says, maybe we ought to align with the Japanese. So it does. In December of 1941, Japan starts the occupation of British Burma. It attacks on the south. Let me get that out of the way. Attacks on the south and begins to move north. The British India, a very large country, takes on a key role as an Allied stronghold. And it has a role in this story too. So the U.S. wanted to keep China in the war, and Japan wanted to get China out of the war. Why would the U.S. and Britain want to keep China in the war? There were 1 million Japanese troops in China at this time. 1 million Japanese troops. If China falls, at least half of those Japanese troops are liberated to go fight elsewhere in the Pacific. And that's not something the United States or Britain wanted to see. So we keep pushing arms and supplies to China. And we were originally using the ports, the major ports of China. But with the Japanese occupation, that was going to stop. So the Japanese wanted to stop supplies flowing through Burma to U.S. and Chinese forces fighting them. Japan also wanted to drive India away from Britain. India was a big Britain colony, and at this time there was a large independence moving in India that said we wanted to be our own country. So Japan thought that by putting pressure on India and maybe even invading part of it, that the British would get kicked out and India would become its own independent country allied with Japan. So after the fall of the Chinese ports, shown here in green, Burma was the key route for the Allies to get supplies up into China. And you see two arrows on that screen. The bottom arrow points to the major port of Rangoon, and there were rail lines out of Rangoon headed north, and supplies would then pass into China up to the north. You also see a horizontal arrow, which is supply lines from India moving into China by way of what was called the Burma Road. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So Japan invades Burma and begins to move north. There you see the Burma Road outlined in red, and you see a blue line which represents the air route from India into China. That was called flying the hump, and we'll talk some about that too. When the road is captured, flying the hump becomes the only way to get supplies into China. There's what the Burma Road looked like. This is not Interstate 25. It's a pretty hard, arduous route. And in the picture on the left, if you look real close near the bottom of the picture, you see a speck, and that's a truck moving up the Burma Road. So even if you keep the road open in its present configuration, it still is a limited supply chain. Oops, sorry, hit the wrong button there. Why Burma? Again, flying the hump, dangerous. Couldn't meet the supply needs of the U.S. and Chinese forces. So what is flying the hump? U.S. Army Air Force's transports flew from northeast India across the Himalayas to Kunming and other bases in China. And there you see a C-47, I think that's a 47, might be a 46, C-46 transport flying over that part of the Himalayas. Flights were over 20,000 feet, often in terrible weather, oxygen and cold gear required. So it was a very difficult thing in marginal weather for these pilots to do. And all of the gas that was going to fly the Flying Tigers and other operations in China had to be flown in over that Himalayan mountain pass. So it was quite an arduous process. Over 500 airplanes were lost along that route from India into China and back. It became known as the Aluminum Trail. And we have a display over in the main pavilion of a guy who flew that route, had to bail out once. The D-ring from his parachute is mounted over there. and it tells his story. So if you want to know more about flying the Hump, I recommend you walk across the way. It's kind of back where the Doolittle is and the TBM Avenger is. It's back in that corner. At the peak of the flights across the Himalayas, there was an airplane passing over every couple of minutes. It was a very, very busy, intense, arduous operation. And it still didn't meet the supply needs. So what are the Allies to do? Well, the British want to try to do something on the cheap. Remember, the British are focused on Europe. They have all of their forces mainly deployed in Europe. They're fighting Rommel in North Africa. And so they didn't have a lot of forces in the China-Burma-India theater. That was the Allies' main focus at the time. So the Allies want to forestall a Japanese move toward India. They want to reopen the supply lines into China. What can they do? Well, with their limited resources, they can't do much. Enter a British general by the name of Orde Wingate and his unconventional warfare ideas. And that's Wingate you see in the picture on the right. He's a very interesting guy. There you see him again on the right. You'll notice he's carrying a British Enfield rifle. Sometimes he didn't wear a watch but carried an alarm clock in his pocket. He was an expert on unconventional warfare. And where did he get his expertise? He fought the Arabs in an Arab uprising in Palestine. When have you heard about uprisings in Palestine? Huh? Like the Gaza Strip, you know? And he also opposed the Italian invasion of North Africa and the Libyan desert, fighting at night and doing special operations. So Wingate's the best of the British in terms of understanding unconventional warfare and what it can do. Whoops. He's an eccentric loner who didn't have many friends in the British Army because most of them thought this unconventional guy was kind of weird. But he did have one really good friend, a guy by the name of Archibald Wavell, who was the commander of British forces in that area. Okay, so he had one really good friend. So Wingate proposes in 1943 an operation called Longcloth. Now, I've been asked, how do they come up with names of operations? And the answer is they're printed in a book. And when you schedule an operation, they go down the book and you get a name. And it may have something to do with what you're doing, or it may be completely independent. So this one's called Operation Longcloth. And what Wingate's plan is to take a brigade-sized force. What's a brigade? 3,000 people, maybe, something like that. Brigade-sized force behind enemy lines to destroy and disrupt their operations. That is, go unconventionally behind existing lines. Be quick-hitting, fast-moving, be supplied by air, and attack from the dark, from the jungle, hit fast, do damage, and leave. The forces that he had were made up of British, Burmese, East African, and Indian troops, and they called themselves Chindits. Chindits is a kind of a partial use of the name Chintha. And you see a Chintha in the lower left-hand corner of this picture. They were the temple guards that were outside of Burmese temples. So the Burmese recommended the name Chindits, and that stuck. Longcloth was a successful operation. They went behind Japanese lines, destroyed, disrupted, but it wasn't a very big operation, didn't have a major effect, and they did have one problem. They had no way to evacuate their wounded. And that's pretty demoralizing to a force when, if you get wounded, they give you a rifle and a couple of days' rations and say good luck and walk off. So that's what they did in Operation Longcloth, and it really affected morale. And because everything was on foot, the troops got tired very quickly, they got dehydrated, they started losing weight. So while it was successful, it certainly devastated the units that survived. Out of the 3,000 or so people they put in, 2,000 came back. You can see the Chindits in this photograph. You see them crossing a river there, and you can see the mules they used as their pack carriers. So there's a germ of an idea here. Wingate proposes to Wavell, he's got this great idea for putting a much bigger force behind Japanese lines, but he needs air support. So Wavell takes him to see Winston Churchill, and Wingate briefed Churchill. Now, Churchill is a lover of unconventional warfare ideas. He supports all kinds of crazy things. And he says, ooh, I like this. This is cool. But he talks to the Royal Air Force, and the Royal Air Force people tell him, we don't have the air power. We don't have the capability to do what Wingate wants to do. So Winston Churchill takes Wingate in hand when he goes to the Quebec conference in Canada, where he's going to meet with Roosevelt. And he wants Wingate to brief Roosevelt on this idea so he can ask Roosevelt to supply U.S. air power for the missing piece of the plan. So here you see in this picture, in the front row is Mackenzie King. He's the Prime Minister of Canada. Churchill, Roosevelt, and the combined chiefs of staff of Britain and the United States. So that's the conference where Roosevelt gets briefed on this idea. So Wingate says long-range penetration groups, LRPGs, are going to play a significant role in a much larger offensive. Churchill takes Wingate to brief Roosevelt, ask for U.S. help. Roosevelt loves the idea. Let's do this. Okay. Roosevelt then turns to George Marshall, who's the Chief of Staff of the Army, and to Hap Arnold, who runs the Air Force, and says, you guys figure out a way to provide the air part of what Wingate needs to pull this off. So that leads us into the next part of our story. So here's the 1944-45 Burma campaign plan. The first thing they're going to do is put 4,000 Chindit troops by air behind enemy lines to disrupt and destroy Japanese supply lines. And that's going to be Operation Thursday. And you see the red arrow with number 1. That's inserting 4,000 British troops, essentially, behind 200 miles behind Japanese lines. It actually turns out to be almost twice the number. It comes out to be about 9,000 troops. Okay? What's part 2 of the plan? There'll be a major U.S. and Chinese ground offensive attack from the north and east to reopen the Burma Road into China so we can up our supplies deliveries to the Chinese and U.S. forces. The third part is Chindit ground forces come in from the north and link up with the air-delivered troops. So that's the 3 main parts of this new offensive. The Chindits will withdraw after about 60 days because a monsoon will set in of heavy rains, and it's going to be very difficult to conduct operations behind Japanese lines during periods of the monsoon. Other troops the plan is to expand operations south as the monsoon permits. So Hap Arnold says, we're going to establish a new Army Air Forces unit to do the things that Wingate needs to do to implement that plan. Arnold embraces the plan. He sees it as a way to exploit and expand air power. He interviews 2 guys to run this operation. Lieutenant Colonel John Alison, you see on the left, and Lieutenant Colonel Phil Cochran, you see on the right. Anybody ever heard of these guys before? We got 1 guy back there who's okay. So they're going to establish a new unit just for the purpose of supporting Wingate's long-range penetration groups. Arnold sees leadership as a key quality, and he interviews these 2 guys because they have that aura of great leadership. Arnold picks both great leaders. He picks P-40 Commander Lieutenant Colonel Phil Cochran, a fighter guy, aggressive, confident leader. I'll tell you more about him in a minute. By the way, Phil Cochran's the guy on the right. He also picks P-40 Ace Lieutenant Colonel John Alison, guy on the left. and the guy in the middle is Orde Wingate. Both initially resist. Alison and Cochran both say, hey, we're experienced fighter guys. We want to be in the big fight. We don't want this sideshow. But Arnold tells them, read my lips, you don't understand. You're going to run this thing. So they say, okay, salute and carry on. And they do a fantastic job. They are friends. They've been friends for a long time. They essentially flip a coin because co-commanders can't run an organization. You can't have two commanders. One guy has got to be in charge. So they agree Cochran's going to be the lead. And he becomes the commander of what's going to be this provisional air outfit. So a little bit more about Cochran and Alison. Cochran joined the Air Corps in 1935. He was a fighter guy. He led a squadron in North Africa of P-48s doing ground support for French troops. He's a natural leader. Alison joined in 1936. He was an air attaché in the UK during the Battle of Britain, saw how that going on. He later moved to the Soviet Union when we started sending Lend-Lease airplanes over to the Soviet Union. And in 1942, he was part of the 23rd Fighter Group, which was the successor to the Flying Tigers in China. He was an ace, had 7 victories. So 2 really good guys. What's the mission of this new Air Force unit? The mission is airlift Wingate's troops behind 200 miles behind Japanese lines. Supply those troops and evacuate their wounded. Provide a small air covering and striking force to support them. And acquire air experience for deep penetration missions. Learn how to do this job. Because Arnold thinks they're going to have more need for these kinds of operations. This special new unit is going to be assigned to the Southeast Asia Command for administrative purposes and support, but they're going to report directly to Arnold as the head of the Air Force. You got a direct line to Arnold. And Arnold says, whatever you need, you get. If anybody gives you any grief, tell me and I'll fix it. That's a pretty good thing to have. So they call themselves the 53rd 18th Provisional Unit Air. What a name, huh? And they are given a blank check to establish the unit any way they want. So initially they set about picking what kind of airframes they want. They settle on 30 P-51A fighters, and you see P-51As lined up here in China, in Burma, in India. They want 13 C-47 transports. They select 150 gliders. Now you're going to ask, what are they going to do with gliders? We're going to tell you. They pick some light transports, UC-64s. They pick 100 light airplanes, L-1 and L-5s. We have an L-5 in the next hangar over, so after this talk, when you see the great role that L-5s play in this operation, you can go look at one. They pick 6 of brand new helicopters, first helicopters ever invented. They actually only ever get 4, but they wanted 6. And a helicopter plays one interesting story in this operation. They also pick 12 B-25Hs. Now the H is a gunship. It is not the standard mid kind of bomber from altitude. It's meant for low-level attack. They individually handpick 500 volunteers. Now for that many airplanes and the size of force they're going to have, you typically have a unit of maybe 1,000 to 2,000 people. They're going to do it with a little bit more than 500. So it's a very unique, dedicated operation. Here's again a look at the airplanes. The L-5 is in the upper left. You see the C-47 center high. You see the gliders over on the right. The B-25 Attack H models are in the center. The light transports are in the lower left, the P-51s are in the center, and that new helicopter is over on the right. The B-51 G and H models had a 75 millimeter cannon in the front. It's essentially a tank gun. And you see the meat part of what the gun looks like in the lower right photo. That part sits kind of behind the pilot, low in the B-25. Most of the models they had 4 50 caliber machine guns in the front. This one only shows 2. What's a CG-4A glider? Well, it's an unpowered airplane that needs to be dragged to altitude. It will carry 13 troops or about 4,000 pounds of cargo. They're 48 feet long, 83-foot wingspan. There's 2 enlisted pilots. There's a depiction of the cockpit in the lower right, and you can see it's pretty austere. The max speed you can pull a glider at is 150 miles an hour, and you normally cruise with them about 73 miles an hour, which means the C-47 transport that's pulling them is throttled way back. They're made out of wood, cloth, and tubes, steel and aluminum tubes. Takes about 600 feet to normally land one. They do have a landing gear. The front pivots up. You can put a Jeep inside. That's a CG-4A glider. So the first thing they do is establish their unit, man it up, get their airplanes, ship it off to India, and start training. The unit goes to India in December of '43. Their airplanes are shipped over by boat, except for the C-47s. They take over 2 grass strips shown in that circle in the picture of India at the top. You can see that circle is pretty close to the Burmese border. One strip is for C-47s and gliders. The other one is for the fighters, bombers, and liaison aircraft. They conduct full-time training with their Chindit troops that they're going to carry into battle. They exercise. They go through a period of trying to put the horses and mules on C-47s and gliders, which is kind of an interesting experience. But once they get them on, it works pretty well. It's the getting them on is the problem. They practice glider snatches. Now, glider snatch is an interesting proposition. C-47 on the ground, they mount its tow rope on a circular wire device held up by 2 poles. C-47 comes flying in about 70 knots at about 20 feet, drags a hook and catches the tow rope of that glider and yanks that glider right off the ground. It's an exciting ride, and if you go on YouTube, there's a couple of videos of how they do that. Pretty exciting ride. So they do use glider snatches in the course of executing this operation, but not very many of them. Mostly they're conventional glider pulls. These guys, because there are so few of them, work long hours. Their work is classified. They have visitors come in, and they're kind of scruffy looking because they're working so hard. And the commander gets a little lecture about, your guys don't look like Air Force guys. You know, they're kind of scruffy looking. So Cochran ends up writing this memo to his people, and I'll read it to you. Look, sports, the beards and attempts at beards are not appreciated by visitors. Since we can't explain to all visitors that the fuzz is a gag, we must avoid their reporting that we are unshaven, regulations say shave, by appearing like Saturday Night in Jersey. Work comes before shaving. You will never be criticized for being unkempt if you are so damn busy you can't take time to doll up. But be clean while you can. Ain't it awful? Phil Cochran. So he's a guy that's loved by his troops. He's a tremendous leader, but shows you, A, they work hard, and B, they have a sense of humor, and C, he's a good leader. So the Operation Thursday, what is that? Operation Thursday is the taking in of all Wingate's troops and supporting them by air once they're in. Deliver the assault groups. They take in engineers by gliders 200 miles behind enemy lines. The plan is to take them to 3 kind of open areas One's called Piccadilly, one's called Broadway, and one's called Chowring-Hee. Where did those names come from? Piccadilly is a big street in London, Broadway is a big street in New York, and Chowring-Hee is a big street in Calcutta. That's where those names came from. Engineers, after they immediately land, clean landing strips so they can fly in 200 miles behind Japanese lines, C-47s with supplies and troops. Okay. The remainder of the 4 Chindit brigades airland over 7 days after they get the strips open to C-47s. So where do the extra C-47s come from? They come from the Army Air Force's Transport Service and the Royal Air Force. They provide the additional transports needed to carry on the bulk of the troop landing. And the transports and light aircraft will resupply and evacuate wounded. And the fighters and bombers of Cochran's outfit will provide support, beat off any Japanese attacks, attack Japanese airfields in the vicinity so they can't come after the forward bases. The picture you see there is the engineers getting the field prep for C-47 landings. So here's kind of a visual display of what's going on a map. Okay. On the left side of the map, you see a green square. That's where those 2 airfields are. They're going to haul out from those 2 airfields and fly those green lines over to the 3 red circles that you see that are behind 200 miles behind Japanese lines. Japanese lines are where those squiggly red things are, kind of in the middle. That's Japanese probing attacks trying to start an invasion of India. There's also a green line coming down from the north. That's the troops, the Chindit troops are going to march in from the north. And you see some red arrows coming down. That's the Chinese and American forces that are coming down to liberate the Burma Road. So the 3 areas they want to land at, Broadway, Piccadilly, and Chowring-Hee, are in those 3 red circles. Okay. The operation, which is called Operation Thursday, begins on 5 March 1944. They take 600 men, mules, and supplies and head toward Broadway at night using 60 gliders. So think of this, C-47s trying to tow 2 gliders simultaneously. They're going over the end of the Himalayas, so they got to get up to about 10, 15,000 feet, pulling those 2 gliders. Okay. They're going to cut those gliders loose in the dark and have them land at the open spaces where they've scouted and they think are okay. Okay. They all head to Broadway instead of the other 2 sites because late intel pictures show that there are logs and things that have been pulled over one of the sites, and the other site is too far away. It's the 3rd one out, and it's too far out there on its own. So they say, okay, if we have to kill Piccadilly in the middle, we won't do Chowring-Hee, we'll take everybody into Broadway. So that's what they start doing. But little unbeknownst to the glider pilots, the Chindit troops have stuffed all kinds of extra supplies on the gliders. More food, more ammo, and they're terribly overweight. So they have to cut 9 loose before they even get going. A couple of C-47s have mechanical problems. Then, once they do get to Broadway and the initial gliders land, they find out the terrain isn't nearly as good as they thought it might be. There are actually some logs, some ruts, some holes, and almost every one of the gliders that lands shears off its landing gear. Some of them crash pretty badly and troops are killed. Some of the C-47s are recalled. The good thing is no Japanese resistance. Okay, so 37 gliders eventually end up landing at Broadway during the night. 34 of those 37 are totaled out, total wrecks. Can't use them because they've sheared off their landing gear or otherwise been mechanically destroyed. 33 men were evacuated for injuries due to landing. 24 men were killed in glider crashes. But 539 men, 3 mules, and 29,000 pounds of equipment and supplies got landed at Broadway in the first airlift in the dark at night. Engineers complete a 4,500-foot landing strip by the evening of 6 March, and 62 C-47s land at Broadway the night of 6 March. So we're going to put down C-47s in the dark at a 4,500 strip that's been cleared by engineers that day, and it's going to occur in the 12 hours between sunset and sunrise. So you can do a little math and you can figure out they were turning C-47s at a pretty quick rate. On 6 March, they do send some assault people and engineers to Chowring-He by glider, but the operation at Broadway starts going so very well, they don't need it. So they recall them. And the entire operation is going to be run out of this place called Broadway. There's 3 of the B-25Hs. I haven't said it before, but you see all of their airplanes have 5 diagonal stripes. That's their unit insignia, diagonal stripes down the airplanes. On 8 March, Cochrane's fighters and bombers attacked Japanese airfields that were in the vicinity of Broadway. They destroy 43 Japanese airplanes, and they make it pretty tough for Japanese to mount any kind of air attack on the Broadway operation. During 7 and 11 March, there is continuous airlift in and out of Broadway. It's kind of like Atlanta Airport. I mean, their operations going continuously. Or the Berlin Airlift. They're just bringing in 47s, dumping troops, dumping supplies, turn around, go back to India, fly more, come on up, bring more over. So it's a conveyor belt of people and supplies into this base that's 200 miles behind Japanese lines. Operation Thursday ends on 11 March. They have completed the insertion of all of these troops. What did that accomplish? They brought in 9,000 men, 175 horses, over 1,000 mules, 500,000 pounds of cargo, all into Broadway. 25% of that was brought by Cochrane's unit. 75% was brought by the Army Air Force's Transport Command and the Royal Air Force C-47s that were just assigned for this particular short period. On the right there, you see the picture of Broadway. That's the area where the operation took place, and you can see 2 strips that have been outlined there very, very lightly. Those are the landing strips where they brought in all of that stuff. During that period, as soon as they landed, Wingate's troops would be organized into columns. They put out 45 columns to attack the railway running north, all the way from southern Rangoon, all the way up the center of Burma, that the Japanese used as their primary supply line. And they also deployed some to the rivers, the Irrawaddy being one of them, to keep Japanese from moving any supplies of troops up the rivers. So Broadway becomes a main operating base. It supports these insurgents, these 45 unconventional forces that have been deployed to destroy and disrupt, and the operation is just going gangbusters. But a couple of things happen. Well, Wingate and Cochrane maintained Broadway as their main supply base. They even staged light airplanes out of there, L-5s and L-1s. Remember, the L-5's primary mission is take out wounded troops, bring in replacements, take out one. You'll see the L-5 over in the next hangar over there. You know, it doesn't hold very many. It can hold 1 litter and 1 passenger, and that's it. So that's what they do, a lot of flying back and forth. Almost all those L-5s and L-1s are flown by enlisted pilots, not officers. On 13 March through the end of May, the Japanese conduct air attacks and ground attacks. They finally figured out what's going on. They figured out where Broadway is, and they try to eliminate it, but they were entirely unsuccessful. They got one ground attack pretty close, but it was expelled by the Chindit troops. So the Chindit columns, these 45 columns that are out, are every day getting resupplied by parachute, either C-47s or L-5s. They've reconfigured the L-5s, and they can drop parapack bundles off of their wings. And they evacuate wounded and deliver replacements. Think of the difference in morale from Winded's first long cloth, when all wounded had to be left behind, to this operation where within 24 hours of being wounded, they're in a hospital in India. Big difference. The P-51s and the P-25s continue to roam over Burma, hitting supply lines, roads, bridges, and airfields and Japanese troop concentrations. One brigade comes from the north, and they come down and set up another area called White City near the rail line that they want to interdict and prevent the Japanese from using it. Anybody got any idea why they call it White City? Okay. All of the parachute supplies that get parachuted in are using white parachutes. And with supplies over days and days and days, the ground becomes white. So they gave it the name of White City. There's another camp set up at a place called Aberdeen, and those are kind of in the middle there. You can see them with the smaller circles that are near the center. And you can see they're astride the rail line. So they are strangling the British, or the Japanese. They are strangling the Japanese reinforcement and supply lines. Unexpected development. On the 23rd of March, Wingate, who had been at Broadway, has a B-25 flying back to India, and it crashes on returning from Broadway. And Wingate is killed. So the lead dynamic leader of this whole thing, the guy whose idea is being implemented, who people are really crazy about following in this harebrained operation, is killed. The new commander who's assigned to take over has experience working with the Chindits, but he's not a big believer in much of what Wingate's philosophy is of operating behind enemy lines. But the operation continues. Cochran and Alison's unit is renamed from the 53rd 18th Provisional Unit, and it's redesignated as the 1st Air Commando Group. And so it becomes the first organized group especially dedicated to unconventional warfare. Go deep behind enemy lines, supply by air, keep the operation going. On 28 March, Alison is recalled to the U.S. to begin setting up more Air Commando groups. Okay, so there are 2 more Air Commando groups eventually set up. In March and April, the Air Commandos continue to work on destroying Japanese aircraft, to stopping their deployment of forces north, to eliminate bridges over those rivers that you saw, to diminish their rail stock, so they become a real pain in the rear to the Japanese. They provide close air support, transport of medical evacuees and replacements. On the 23rd of April, they conduct the first ever combat rescue by helicopter. How did this happen? An L-5 was bringing in some wounded back from Broadway. It had a mechanical problem and went down in Japanese territory. They couldn't get another L-5 in. There wasn't enough space to land it, although an L-5 doesn't take much space. So they call on the helicopter. He flies out of India in multiple hops because he can only go a short distance at a time. When he finally gets to the area where the men are, and they're being chased by Japanese, he sets down. He can haul 1 out at a time. That's all he can take. Pilot and 1 passenger. So he makes 3 trips in, brings them out to a sandbar in a river where they could haul in, they could fly in an L-5, pick up the guys, and take them back to to India, which they did. So this is the first helicopter rescue. The mission ends. Late May, the Chindits abandoned strongholds and moved north to join the U.S. offensive and the Chinese forces up north. With the monsoon, flying conditions deteriorate markedly. The Air Commandos can't do a lot of good, so they terminate their operation except for the light airplanes, L-1s, L-5s, doing medical evacuation and flying in replacements. Cochran returns to the U.S., turns over command of the 1st Air Commandos to another colonel. The immediate momentum for the recapture of all of Burma died with Wingate until late in the war. So once they liberate enough space where they can reopen the Burma Road, they essentially stop pushing the Japanese. And much of South Burma remains occupied by the Japanese until very late in the war. There is a 2nd and 3rd Air Commando Group formed, but they were never used as a single force. Their forces were later integrated into other Army Air Force commands. And for a time after World War II, the Army Air Forces forgot all about how to do insurgency and special operations. What happens to Alison and Cochran? Alison later commands the 3rd Air Commando Group in the Pacific, but it never does anything really monumental. After the war, he attains the grade of Major General in the Air Force Reserve and held posts in the government as Assistant Secretary of Commerce and was at it for a time Vice President of Northrop Aircraft. Cochran is assigned to Eisenhower's staff for the D-Day invasion. Follow-on to the D-Day invasion. He's a fighter expert. Remember, he was a P-40 guy originally. He's medically grounded in 1947, had some health issues. He got out of the Army Air Forces, became an air advisor for movie producers. One of the movies he advised was a movie called Jet Pilot with John Wayne. He joins his brother's trucking company as an executive and suffers a heart attack and dies while on a hunting expedition. Well, the guy on my left, or on your left, circled there, should remind you a lot of Phil Cochran, because it is. There's a comic strip cartoonist by the name of Milt Caniff. Anybody ever heard of Milt? No? Okay. He drew a strip called Terry and the Pirates. When Caniff was in college at Ohio State, he roomed with Cochran's brother and got to know Phil really well. So when he started drawing this script that had to do with Southeast Asia and all of the shenanigans that were going on during the war and post-war in Southeast Asia, he makes one of his characters a guy by the name of Flip Corkin. Flip Corkin is Phil Cochran. A Doolittle Raider was one of the pilots on this mission. One C-47 pilot that hauled gliders into Broadway was a guy by the name of Dick Cole. Maybe that name rings a bell with you. There's his photo on the right there. Dick Cole was co-pilot in Jimmy Doolittle's #1 B-25 on the Doolittle Raid in April of 1942. After he got done with the Doolittle Raid, he came back to the States for a while, but ended up being a C-47 pilot chosen for the 1st Air Commandos. Cole has visited this museum a couple of times before he passed away at the age of 103. He's provided many of the artifacts you see in our Doolittle area in the main pavilion over there. I got to tour him a little bit in the museum here during his first visit, and I'm guessing was around 2014 maybe. I didn't know who he was originally, but I found out as we were walking around. He's the most non-self-important guy that you would meet, just a regular good old guy. And he didn't think he was a hero. Anyway, I got to spend about 30 minutes talking to him, and we talked a lot about Operation Thursday. And although almost always he was famous for the Doolittle Raid, he was just as proud, if not more so, in his contribution to the 1st Air Commandos. So, the Air Commandos demonstrated the role that air power can play in unconventional warfare. Take a force behind enemy lines and sustain it by air as long as it needs to be sustained. Thursday was key in liberating North Burma to get that road back opened again. And once we got that road back open, a guy by the name of Stilwell with a whole bunch of U.S. Army troops could go about liberating the rest of Burma and making sure that China was not going to fall to the Japanese. Thursday was a precursor to today's deep insertion missions. Today we don't use gliders, we use helicopters, we use vertical takeoff and landing airplanes like the V-22 Osprey. Think of the Get Bin Laden raid. The Get Bin Laden raid is what these guys did with gliders. Okay? Elements of the U.S. Air Force, Army, and Navy carry out that role today of doing air insurgency, air special missions. In fact, there is a new Army initiative to buy vertical takeoff airplanes, not helicopters, vertical takeoff and landing airplanes that can deploy a whole regiment 400 miles behind enemy lines in one night. That's what they want to do. So anytime, anywhere, any place, or any place, anytime, anywhere, is something that still exists today, and that heritage dates back to Operation Thursday. That's the end of my story.